Howdy guys, in this video I'm going to talk about the dollar hegemony. Now this is a term that many of you might have heard before, but in case you don't know, essentially what the dollar hegemony is as a result of World War II, during towards the end of the war in 1944, they decided that the people that basically were winning the war were deciding, okay, we need a new monetary order here because, the end of World War One ended up in all these reparations that essentially ended up creating, the Third Reich and all of the badness that came out of that. Now, that was the rationale for Bretton Woods, but essentially what it did was it put the dollar as the equivalent of gold. So instead of having gold in central bank vaults all around the world, since the U.S. had a lot of the gold already, and this mostly from the result of World War II, they decided, okay, well, the dollar is the same as gold, so you can just keep it in the vault. And instead of settling in gold, which was done for a very long time, they would settle in dollars. And that essentially made dollars the preeminent currency for any kind of international settlement all around the world. And this made some sort of sense. The U.S. had won essentially the entire war. Obviously the Soviet Union also won its portion, and the world divided into what at that time they called the First and Second World, and the Third World was this group of countries that essentially wasn't in either sphere of influence, but neither really wanted influence over those countries because they were so poor and so on. Anyway, the USSR at that point was exerting its influence through military means and through puppet governments and so on. And not that the US didn't do that. There were certainly a lot of banana republics and so on all over there in South America. But what the U.S. decided to do was to create a monetary hegemony through the dollar, and because the dollar was used as the settlement currency all over the world, it gave the dollar a privileged position. And if you've ever had this sort of like vague sense that the U.S. is privileged in some way versus the rest of the world, this is the reason why. It's because of the dollar hegemony. Now, what made it much worse was when about 27 years later, and that's, if you think about it, not that long of a time, 1944 to 1971, 27 years, the dollar standard as pegged to gold essentially ended up crumbling as the U.S. kept wanting to print more money and so on. And that would cause more conversions, and essentially the U.S. closed the gold window, as they were liable to call it. So central banks that were holding dollars could no longer trade them in for gold, and this kind of caused a problem because every currency was already sort of more or less trading against the dollar as if it were gold, and all of a sudden that went away. And the dollar was floating, and all these other currencies were floating. So you had like float against float, and you had this weird situation where everything was essentially fiat currency, at least nominally before. Things were pegged in some way back to gold, but it was no longer after Richard Nixon cut off the peg to gold. And of course, gold went up in value tremendously, and at least in the U.S., they experienced some serious inflation as a result of all of that. There was a lot of money printing and so on, and essentially. The U.S. had to pivot to something called the petrodollar, which kept it as sort of like the preeminent currency for foreign settlement, and that means that the U.S. through dollar printing essentially sort of exports that inflation because every other central bank holds dollars in their reserve. And those dollars are inflated in the sense that each of those central banks has a lesser portion. Now, they don't exactly hold dollars. They hold treasuries, and those are going up at like 1 or 2% a year, maybe 3%, something like that. But the rate of monetary expansion is significantly higher, something like 6.7%. So, they're essentially losing the difference every year through the U.S. monetary expansion. And to make up for that, they often print more of their own money, which means that their own citizens get screwed as a result of not just their own government's inflation, but the monetary expansion of the United States. And this is true everywhere because, again, the dollar is the settlement currency. And most economies or most central banks try to keep some sort of a peg to the dollar or a steady range so that trade across the world becomes easier because we are essentially under a dollar standard. So when I say dollar hegemony, I mean that it's a way for the U.S. to control the rest of the world. And you can see this very clearly when you look at sanctioned places like Iran. Now, in the old days, like you couldn't enforce any sort of sanction because any sort of cartel is very unstable. Anybody that's breaking it has enormous profits to make and so on. So, cartels just wouldn't last or whatever. But because the world is essentially on the dollar standard, the U.S. can essentially threaten everybody else. Hey, if you don't work with us and block Iran, then we are going to punish you by making it very hard for you to settle in dollars. And this is essentially what's happened, right? Like it's whenever you have any two countries that want to trade, because the dollar's the unit of settlement or for any sort of international trade, that means that money has to flow through some bank in New York every time two countries, maybe even their neighbors, like trade with each other. And this is kind of a weird thing if you think about it, but that's how the international monetary system works. It was the new world order that they created way back in '44 with the Bretton Woods Agreement, and that's where we stand today. Anyway, it's just a little bit of a rant on how all this works. And if you want to know a little bit more about it, it's we do mention it in the little Bitcoin book. I'll probably write more about it at some point, but hope that helps you. This song is done.